This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
Okay. Someone in our group rather beautifully said that the Cusk piece was working with a sedimented discourse with all sorts of stuff rising to the surface in terms of the metaphors and the things that that she says. So that's really where I'm starting, and it's also a veiled excuse for any confusion or kind of lack of clarity in the way that this is structured. So things that rise to the surface. Thinking really first about non-standard forms of motherhood, there's a metaphor that runs through the piece that we were looking at about a park. Rachel Cusk is sitting in the park looking at this kind of ideal, this image of this ideal family who are kind of cycling along, and what it made us all feel that she was very much on the outside of this idealised family. She was seeing this ideal family unit, and there's a suggestion that somehow it's seen as a superior model, because if you are on the outside, you're a pariah. And also the whole metaphor of a park implies that people are judging you, they're looking at you, they're looking at the way that you do parenting. So there's a sense of feeling judged as well about the model of parenting that you're presenting to the world. And what Cusk is talking about is resisting this idealised model of family life, because she talks a lot about that idealised family being representative of avoiding risk. The other interesting thing about this image of a public space is it's where you perform your parent skills. I mean, quite often that's when you publicly get access to the way people do parenting, and it's particularly where men perform their caring, and particularly divorced men, the cliche of divorced men running around the park on a Sunday afternoon, and you see them doing parenting in a way that mothers don't necessarily do, which circles back to that question that was being discussed earlier. About the way mother's mother and the way father's mother or parent. The other big theme that comes from her book and this reading was that divorce blurs the gender roles. You no longer feel at home. You are literally an outsider because your state has changed. You're outside this world of the family, so you start to have to reassess what that means to you. And so through the book there was a great sense of a kind of before and after element in Cusk's own experience, and that her gaze had changed post her divorce, and there was a sense of her being misled and actually questioning the images that are out there about the standard family. So the text was moving from the personal example to think about all the other lives that people were living, and that was a kind of metaphoric leap from her moving really from the personal to the very particular in the text, because she uses a lot of analogies to, for anybody who hasn't read it, to Greek myth, to the whole kind of the child, the Jesus myth as well, the myth as she puts it, and so she's jumping from the personal to the general in the way that she's describing her experience, and she's putting up divorce as the thing that for her produces the aftermath of the title of her book, and it's the thing that precipitates the answering of the question in her of who she is and where she is in the family structure. And it's about making visible the things that weren't previously visible, that weren't previously voiced. And there's a key question raised in this about how one defines oneself as a parent. And the whole theme of aftermath is about something breaking and there being a second sowing, so a rethinking of how one has constructed everything in one's own head. And there are some kind of interesting myths here, talking about, for example, breaking the Holy Family. And also she uses the metaphor of her family holiday. She has this notion of the perfect family holiday, the thing that they always used to do. And she talks in very grisly detail about how it all goes horribly wrong. And she's trying to perform this idealised role in a family, but then she decides to opt out. And basically what this is all doing is a meditation on what's new coming out of what has been, and trying to use that as a springboard to work out where you're going to go next. There's also an interesting theme around the questioning of the masculine role, coming partly out of the park imagery. A park's a place of risk. It's about testing limits, and that produces a thought: what will authority be? And her use of the metaphors also about the lie of the virgin birth, as she puts it, and the gutless lack of eros in Christianity. The actual quote is gutless masculinity and masculine impotence. And so she's using that as a metaphor to actually question where the new authority is in her new family and the aftermath of divorce, and also where the authority lies anyway in families. And she's questioning the idea that, what happened to the kinetic of men and women, the passionate union, the passionate conflict. So basically, what happens when men and women move from their own relationship to this notion of being parents, and what happens to all those elemental emotional things that they were much more associated with when they were individuals. And she explores this also through her use of Greek mythology. In her own story, she talks about the role reversal of parenting. What she and her husband actually did is switch roles. She became the person that went out and earned the money, and he was the one that stayed at home. And she called, she typified them as being transvestites, because actually what they'd done is just changed gender identities, they changed roles. And she took this, the authority that was otherwise supposed to be the father's role, but is now living in this kind of post-familial household. But we thought what was interesting about all of this is it's not an equal parenting relationship that she has moved towards. What she was talking about is actually just switching roles, and back to this myth of the baby Jesus. What she was doing is despising the surrendered masculinity that her husband was exhibiting to her. So it's almost as if he'd become the 50 surrendered housewife, and that's the model that had changed round for them. So it's still, for her and for us, an open question of where will the authority be in the family. So for us, a very big question that we wanted to carry forward is this issue of where does the issue of authority lie in the family. Now, in her wider work, she questions and tries to expose the power relationships within families that are largely in life and unexamined and unvoiced, which circles back to the very first thing about her use of metaphor, her telling of her personal story as well, and using the aftermath of this big life event in order to try and be more examining of how one transitions from this view you have in your head of this traditional family to a non-conventional family. Finally, I think the Greek metaphor also helps us take a longer view of what motherhood means, which again links to previous comments in the session about the idealised family being a relatively recent construction, and actually something that's rather confining, whereas in the past it wasn't so confining. And we were wondering when there was this transition in the 50s, when domestic chores meant that less time was spent in the kind of time-consuming act of motherhood, whether that then starts to prompt people to ask some more interesting questions about what motherhood means, what is the role of a mother, because that's the only real time when people have the time and space to do that. Finally, Cusk's battle cry right through her work is "I tell the truth, I have the emotional authority." And there were parallels here, particularly with Katerina's paper, about the mother claiming the truth about her own version of motherhood. But it's a biased truth, and emotion becomes almost an alternative kind of logic. And the big metaphor used in Cusk's text that's relevant to this is her use of Antigone as this metaphor for being questioning and setting up a new order. But it's a problematic, ambivalent metaphor, because burying her brother is holding up the old order. So the key question here for all of us is, can there be something new, or are we doomed to repeat the same kind of relationships? Are we doomed to take all those assumptions that we have from a long past with us? Now, have I missed anything, guys, who are in the room, that I should have said? No? Have I got any more minutes? There's one more thing? One more minute. Okay. What can a literary text communicate? Actual addressing of one of the objectives here. which is probably the first time I've done that. It can articulate anxieties that are too difficult to face in the context of real life. And the act of reading and writing makes you attend to parts of yourself that have previously been unexamined. And in drawing attention to our narratives from the past that shape the structures we live within, we can think about it, as was the case in Aftermath, and create a new reality by looking those issues in the face. So that's what we felt the act of reading and writing was bringing to this kind of discussion. Although somewhat ironically, the personal story told by Rachel Cusk is one of a standard white middle-class family.